let's go ahead and talk about the year ahead, which in some ways is also a year in review. But the year ahead, what 2026 holds in terms of the world we're facing, I mean, it's staring us in the face. Biometrics, digital IDs. Yes, that was a threat last year as we began 2025. It's even more of a threat right now because the agenda, as we move closer and closer to the year 2030 and the Agenda 2030 and Sustainable Development Goals and Great Reset and all this sorts of stuff, it is advancing. We did not see a slowing down of this agenda in 2025. You know, all the people who thought maybe voting for Trump was going to slow this agenda down, sorry to say, you didn't get that. And we'll get into that in a moment. But when I look at the year ahead, when I think about 2026, I do see biometrics and digital IDs in our future. Just to kind of put this into perspective, the US back in late October announced mandatory biometric entry and exit system for foreigners, which literally just began last week on December 26th, the day after Christmas. So now, even though they've been testing it out for years, it is completely mandatory for any foreigner who is coming into the United States to have their eyeballs scanned and their face scanned and their fingerprints taken. And they're also talking about asking for 5 years worth of social media history. So there's that going on. We know that the EU also implemented a similar thing in October, which is going to be fully implemented by April. Even my home country of Mexico, or my adopted home country, they passed a package of laws this summer, which are supposed to go into effect in February and then sometime in the spring, talking about biometrics in order to access the internet and biometrics to access phone service. A lot of scary things that, you know, they're being fought in the courts and we'll see what happens. But the point is, it's advancing there. And we've been talking about this. You know, I did this report just a couple of weeks ago, or Don Villa wrote this article a couple of weeks ago. Where's your line in the sand on digital ID? I did this one back in October. Digital IDs are the line in the sand. What are you willing to do to stay free? And that, my friends, remains the questions. What are you willing to do to stay free in 2026? Are you willing to give up travel? Are you willing to give up certain services? As we see more and more that different services, like I've heard Substack now is even starting to ask certain people to verify their ID. And as I mentioned to you earlier, also now, you know, Facebook is asking me if I want to get my account back, I need to send them a selfie. I don't plan to comply. I'm willing to give up that Facebook page of 27,000 followers and the access that I have to it, even though some would say, Derrick, you're shooting yourself in the foot. Those are people who want to hear your message. Those are people who might come to hear you speak. Those are people who might be wanting to know that your new book is out, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm not going to comply to those systems. And I made a decision long ago that if that meant giving up flying and giving up certain, you know, privileges and even rights, then I would do so, because I'm not going to just complain about it on the internet after all these years and then just go ahead and comply. I wish that there was a mass resistance movement. I wish that we were seeing more movement against these systems. I don't see it happening in the United States. I'm doing my best to try to raise awareness and work with others in Mexico. But unfortunately, it just doesn't seem like there is a lot of resistance. And it's sad to say that's just the reality that we're currently dealing with. I hope in 2026 that changes. So when I'm looking to the year ahead, my manifestation, my prayer, my hope is that there is more resistance to these things in 2026. Because if there is not, well, everything I just said is going to happen. Digital IDs, biometrics, and the world that we are in is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. Already, I can empathize and completely understand why my non-American friends would not want to fly to the U.S. when they're saying they're going to scan your face and fingerprints just to enter the country. They saying you're going to check 5 years worth of social media history. I'm pretty much, unfortunately, checking the EU off my list. You know, I've had friends who visited parts of the EU recently, and they said, hey, they still allow you to opt out. They give you a lot of crap about it. But if you keep, you know, stand your ground and push, eventually they will let you through. Well, how long is that going to last? I don't know. And, you know, maybe I need to hurry up and plan some trips and visit parts of the world, because I haven't got to see the pyramids. I haven't got to go see Czechia, Czech Republic, where part of the Broze family is from. There's definitely a lot of this beautiful world that I want to see. And my hope, my prayer is that we do see mass movements of resistance in 2026, because if we don't, well, my friends, we should not expect anything but biometrics and digital IDs to advance. That's part of what I see coming in 2026. And also, I will talk about my recent documentary, Liberation 2030, in just a bit. And if I bring that into play, I'm manifesting, I'm calling into reality a future where people do exit and build from these systems, and they build lives that are less and less dependent on these systems, at the same time as they resist and they push back and mass protests and whatever is needed. as these things rise, because they're not just going to disappear overnight. And as we've learned, those who've been paying attention, the masses, the vast majority of people, the so-called normies, they will comply. And even some of you who consider yourself awake are going to comply, just like we saw during COVID, because, well, you're not thinking of an exit plan. You're hoping that the courts are going to save you, or that the government's going to save you, or that voting's going to save you. And so in the end, you're going to have no choice but to comply, because you built a life dependent on their system. I'm not saying that's your fault, because maybe you were sold a lie about the American dream or whatever, but more and more people are realizing that's a fraud, and that if you build your life dependent on their systems, then you're going to be dependent on their rules, and that will be coercion and subtle compliance, and then less than subtle compliance as we move from the carrot phase to the stick phase of forcing people to comply with these systems, much like we saw during COVID 1984. Message being, in 2026, I hope you will focus on your exit and build journey and becoming less and less dependent on those systems. If you're interested in that, you can go to theconsciousresistance.com/EXB. That's for exit and build. And that is where I did the 45-day exit and build challenge. I started it last year, I want to say, in 2024. And then I've been promoting it throughout 2025. So I encourage you to check that out. Again, the exit and build challenge, or you can sign up for Civil and get an even more in-depth outline of how to do this with the 10-week opt-out challenge. And you can find that at civil.com/